Hi, this is Chris Howard, host of Plugged In with Chris Howard, and I'm taking the Lions over the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. BetOnline has free odds and lines available online or on your mobile device. Visit BetOnline today.
Well. Welcome to the Media Roundtable Special Edition, where we dive into the secrets of the craft and provide our perspective on industry topics in service of marketers responsible for the success of an audio program, and as we love to call them, the Chief Audio Officer. I'm your host, Dan Granger, CEO and founder of Oxford Road, and today we have the crown jewel of our special edition series. We've been spending most of December looking back at 2023 from a number of different lenses. But today we have probably the most informed group of contributors that we've had, because these are all folks that are journalists who follow the podcast beat and know this, the audio industry cold. And so we've got some real heavy hitters on today and that are going to not just look back at the top stories of 2023, but they're also going to share some predictions about what we see coming in 2024. So let's get into it. I am joined by the great and powerful James Cridland, editor of Pod News and Podcast Business Journal. Welcome back to the show, James. We're always glad to have you here.
It's wonderful to be back. Thank you.
For the first time, we have my friend Ariel Shapiro. Ariel is the lead reporter of Hot Pod, which for many years has been an institution talking about all things industry in audio, and really knows the space intimately. And I'm so glad that you're able to join us for this look back, Ariel. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. I'm really happy to be here.
And then my newest friend is Skye Pillsbury. She is author of the Squeeze newsletter. She also has an illustrious background covering the audio space. She was the original writer for Inside Podcasting, which I've followed for many years, and has just been knee-deep in a number of initiatives that have helped move this industry forward. So Skye, lovely to meet you for the second time, and so glad that you're able to join the conversation.
Very pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, we had a prep call last week, and on that call, Skye was sharing her perspective, and I thought to myself, wow, I really disagree with that. And I said, Skye, can we still be friends if we argue when we're recording this? And she said, absolutely, and she loves to argue. So I think this might get spicy.
Yeah,
and I'm
excited.
really grateful that you're here. So
bring it.
Thank you. All right, let's go, everybody. So first of all, we've been talking about this. We've been referring to it as pod crash. And one of the ways it's been described as the irrational exuberance of big podcasting, which led to massive overspending and ultimately widespread layoffs and show cancellations this year. So, Skye, can you just kick us off by sharing what happened? What happened this year?
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm actually going to go way back and age myself and say that I'm old enough to remember the .com crash that actually happened multiple times. You know, industries are cyclical, and when there is an industry that feels new and is shiny, you know, people come for the gold. And I think that that's what we saw a lot of this year. Were a lot of companies, most notably, most obviously, probably Spotify, coming in and spending hundreds of millions of dollars on companies, and then not only companies, but also celebrity deals and other kinds of deals related to podcasting. And I think it became pretty clear that they didn't know how to execute that well. They wanted to be in the industry. They wanted to be in the space. It seemed like the newest and exciting thing. And we've seen the outcome of that, which is, as you just mentioned, cancellations and layoffs. And we on the commercial side, but we've also actually seen it in public radio. I mean, it's been an industry-wide thing. Of course, there have been fears about economics that have sort of led to people, I think, deciding to move forward with layoffs. But you know, there's lots of different factors that contribute to something like that, of course. But I think that for me, it seems pretty clear that there were some bad decisions made, some mistakes made. And some of the CEOs have actually been really honest about that. Malcolm Gladwell, Daniel Ek being a couple of those.
And when you saw them taking ownership of their contribution to the issue, what do you feel like what was the stated cause, if there was a theme?
For Malcolm Gladwell, I think he literally said we grew too fast. We basically got too excited. I mean, he didn't use the words irrational exuberance, but in recorded internal meetings, that is what he is heard saying. That was not public. That was something that I think was reported by, shoot, I'm spacing. It wasn't me. But it was a recording that someone else reported on. And so that was not public facing information, but it did come out. In the case of Daniel Ek, he took a very, very different tack. Being a public company, he had to speak to investors, and he said, I made a mistake. Those words. And, I appreciate that he did it. Unfortunately, the people who bear the brunt of that it's not him. It's the people, it's the creators, it's the people who worked so hard to build these companies that he acquired. In case that wasn't clear.
I think to Skye's point, you see this crash, and it's not that the industry as a whole just cratered. That's not it. You're seeing it in the kind of studios and shows that are the real prestige programming of the media. Like, these are the shows that you want to see continue. Like, a year ago, 2 years ago, it would be unfathomable that Heavyweight of all shows would be canceled, right? And part of the problem, was, yes, Spotify in particular, but many other companies as well, overspending, not really taking into consideration how much revenue they were bringing in, more so building in the hope that they would generate.
If you build it, they will come.
Exactly, right. So that growth was more important than profit. But then when push came to shove and profit became the thing, these companies are realizing that the way the podcasting business model works right now has a really hard time sustaining these kinds of shows. And that's because investigations, limited series, they're so important, and we need more of them, but they're expensive, right? Like, you're paying for travel, you're paying for multiple producers, engineers. Like, these are not the same kind of productions that you're dealing with just kind of a regular chat show. And also, podcasting is so new that it hasn't really been built out yet to subsidize those, if that was the decision we were going to make, right? Like at a TV, at a TV company, news for like NBC, right? Like, news is never profitable, but they decide to subsidize it with money they get from like theme parks and Bravo and the kind of more fun, trashy stuff that can be used to make something that gives the networks that is something valuable other than just profit and other than just money. And there may still be a way to figure that out, right? Like, I'm not ruling that out, that there is a model somewhere that can sustain these kind of shows. But we're clearly not there yet. And this year has really shown the danger of what happens when you're not able to figure that out.
Yeah, I think when you have a look at some of the companies, I mean, one of the things that really strikes me is, companies like, yes, Spotify, but also Pushkin, APM, WNYC, Cast Media, who seemed to blow up and crash and burn in a very spectacular way earlier on in the year. But we're also seeing companies like Leo Laporte's Twit, one of the first podcast networks really in the world. And they're having to make quite unpleasant cuts as well. So it does appear to be affecting quite a lot of different people in different parts of the industry, which I think is interesting, although all US companies. And I wonder whether that is, as the Brit on this call, I wonder whether that's just sort of something worth bearing in mind, that actually it may be a US thing that blew up over that the finances got very difficult. And so it may be something to do with that. It may also be something to do. I've read a lot of really good articles on this, and a lot of them, and I think Skye ends up making this point very, very clearly as well, is that people who didn't really understand audio were in charge of audio strategy. Dawn Ostroff at Spotify was clearly, she was a TV person. She completely understood how TV works, but that doesn't necessarily translate into a hit podcast. And I think that that's, something that I don't think that the industry yet properly understands, that audio is a very different world, particularly always on audio, very different world to the world of TV and seasons and hit shows and stuff like that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you're saying, with what both of you said. Great points, all of them. I just did want to circle around to what I was saying earlier about the .com boom. At the time, there was so much chatter about how this was the internet. Turned out the internet isn't really going to work. And obviously, that's not what happened. And I think, to Ariel's earlier point, I really do think that people are going to figure this out. Like, in some ways, not to say this had to happen, but I do think that the silver lining, at least, hopefully, as it was after the internet crash, is that people made smarter decisions. They were less willing to throw millions of dollars at projects without really understanding whether those projects would make sense for listeners, and obviously for advertisers and for everyone else who's involved. But I do think that this is going to require people who are still here, who are still surviving. Like, I heard Jenna Weiss Berman on a podcast the other day saying, the business model for us is going to be, we're going to make some shows that aren't quite as expensive, but that are going to be big shows. And those are going to subsidize the narrative serialized shows, which I still really want to make. And, we're going to see much more of that. I'm very curious, actually, to see what this next year is like, because it will require more deep thinking and less money throwing.
Well, so I want to try to encapsulate the diverse perspectives we just got from the three of you, and maybe add a little color of my own. It sounds like especially when we go and talk about the .com boom, I think it's a great parallel. What I see is the same thing, because I got into media around when that started to recover, but we were dealing with the baggage of what a mess it had been. One of the things it had in common, I saw, is that it was all about chasing eyeballs. And they just thought, if you build it and you get people to engage with it, the revenue model will work itself out. It's always going to go up and to the right. Similarly, we had all this hype around podcasting that I think splashed across other facets of audio as well. But everybody just thought, oh, I'm bored. There's a pandemic. I can be an opportunist here. They may not have thought of themselves as opportunists, but people thought there was low-hanging fruit there. They thought they could go in and trade on a name or trade on an idea, and there must be limitless capacity and money to support all these ventures, and they didn't actually do all the math. And I think one of the things that's maybe a little different than the .com boom is everybody got screwed by the .com boom. In this particular case, we are talking about an industry that, even though we're talking about a crash, and, that's my words bringing to it, the industry still grew this year, right? And so to the consumer, to the market broadly, it's still a growing channel. Like, it's doing fine. But if you were one of the content creators, or you're somewhere in the ecosystem and you're betting on this like perpetual escalator to infinity, that's where you're starting to face some challenges. And it's interesting to hear you, Ariel, bring up the idea that a lot of this high production value content was really focused on quality. But I know from being on our side of the fence, by the time you get numbers that you can go sell to brands, the thing is halfway over. And so you're trying to speculate on what it's going to do. Then you're trying to catch up with what it's actually doing. And then, by the time you start to figure it out, like, okay, we just finished the series. And then on the other side of the house, you've got all these celebrity deals, right? Where you've got people pouring millions, tens of millions of dollars into a name that has no track record in this venue whatsoever. Just going, well, they're famous, and so they're going to be successful, obviously. And trying to value those assets the same way they might something that actually has a track record behind it. And so, in my view, a lot of this is healthy but painful in the short term, because it allows us to get a little bit more discerning about what assumptions we're building our plans based on, and if those are reality based or it's fantasy thinking. One of the things we talk about just in running our business is like, when we see an opportunity, how many ifs are there between here and us realizing this great outcome? Is it like, if we can get this relationship to move forward, we will, be more successful because of it? Or it's, if somebody tries something that they've never done, and if that is successful, and then if they sustain and can continue to do it, like, how many ifs we got here? There are way too many ifs that people were making deals on before. So, I think we're all seeing it from different angles, but the story is the same. And now I think the pieces we all have to live with are, what are the implications going forward? And so, James, I know that you flagged that you think that there's going to be some impact on the nature of exclusive deals in the industry. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really just looking back at last year and looking back at the complete about face that we've seen with many companies' plans on exclusives. So Spotify, of course, everything pretty well used to be exclusive to Spotify. The only way of listening was to download the Spotify app and listen through that, with the exception of The Ringer, by the way, which was never had any exclusives. I think Spotify is now interesting in that almost everything is no longer exclusive to the Spotify app. Perhaps they've worked out that the business works better if they can just sell ads across all of the platforms rather than just in the Spotify app itself. The only big exceptions are Joe Rogan, of course, and the Marvel comic stuff, which interestingly they don't call a podcast, they call audio, which I find fascinating. So audio fiction, but it's called audio. So who knows quite what they're doing there. But so I think it's interesting seeing Spotify walking away from subscriptions, but other parts of the industry are actually walking towards it. So we've seen many people jumping into bed with Apple Podcasts for the paid subscriptions thing. But we've also seen companies, again, out of the US, particularly Podimo as one example, who are tying up an awful lot of really good content, making that exclusive, paid for through the Podimo app in their various markets. And they just did a deal not so long back with one of the iHeart shows, where the iHeart show is available everywhere on RSS, apart from in 5 European countries, where they've made that particular show an exclusive to the Podimo app. So I find it fascinating to watch the different plans there in terms of exclusives and in terms of what works, what doesn't. The only thing that I would say is that from what I can see, downloads from the Spotify platform for all podcasts appear to be down quite considerably since August, and I don't know whether that's because of the fact that Spotify have opened up so many more of their shows to other platforms or not. But I find that a fascinating thing. So what will happen with exclusives next year? Who knows? But I think it's a really interesting place to watch.
James, I have a question about Podimo in particular. I think it's really interesting that you bring them up. I haven't really been able to get my hands on it because it's not not available in the US. But they keep trying to get me to write a story about them, and every time I ask about, I say yes, except I would need, some insight into the financials, because, this is, they're trying to do kind of like the Luminary was doing, right?
Yeah.
And like, is that working? Is it worth the cost? And every time I ask for financials, they demur. So I don't know, maybe you have more insight than I do as to whether or not, is it a profitable model? Like, I don't know.
Well, and before you answer that question, I want to pile on and ask, what can you tell us about Apple? Because we know that feature is available. I have no idea how they're doing on, are their subscriptions growing, or did they grow to a peak and now they're winding back? What do we know about either of them?
I mean, I have never, I keep on asking Apple, give us some success stories around Apple Podcasts, paid subscriptions. Not sure that I ever really get any, but so I'm, and of course, one of the issues is that Apple Podcasts is only available on Apple iPhones, on toy phones, and so therefore it's not available on Android. I suspect that that's because of the 30% that Google would want to charge. And if Apple worked out a way of getting around that, then then everything would all crater and crash and burn. So I can kind of understand that. I think Podimo is fascinating. We had somebody. I ran an event in London in early October. We had somebody from Podimo speaking, and one of the things that I asked him on stage was, how is it working financially for you? And he was saying it is very expensive to get into a new market. Because you need the content. You need to be able to actually start with enough content that people will actually pay for. And so some of that is acquisitions, and they are doing some acquisitions, but a lot of that is making stuff. And I find it fascinating, as you do, Ariel, in terms of quite knowing where they're going. But they do seem to be hoovering up, particularly public service talent. From public radio. They seem to be hoovering that talent up, and I know that Denmark Radio has lost a lot of their talent over onto Podimo. Similarly, we're seeing here in Australia, we're seeing some radio talent moving from broadcast radio onto Spotify, who still have a couple of exclusives here as well, actually. So so I'm not sure that exclusives are dead quite yet, but I think it's a fascinating thing to watch.
And that's actually another really interesting point about where these big public radio personalities are going. And, here that's an issue since a lot of people got laid off at NPR, WNYC, PRX, so they're all talented. They have to go somewhere, they are kind of the proven quantities, right? That you could put on a new show and could almost certainly make something good and gain an audience. And to another point, and there's one show that I think has done actually a really good job, is the News Agents. So all former BBC hosts doing this kind of like substantial news chat show. I don't mean chat show to say that lightly, but it's a really good panel podcast. And it's charting like crazy in the UK. I think it's actually doing, for a British news show, it's doing decently well here as well. And so, that's certainly something I would like to see, right? And that was the Gimlet thing. It was taking this public media perspective into a private setting. We saw what happened there, but I think that there's still a lot of potential there for creating things outside of public media with these journalists.
And I wonder how much of that is management of talent, and being able to actually give talent the freedom that they want to do stuff. And that was very much behind the newsagents' shift from the BBC to a commercial radio company, and the production team in there as well. Skye, you were going to jump in as well.
Oh, I actually just had another question for you, James, which is Podimo venture backed? Like, how are they getting the money to hoover up all of these people?
Oh, ask me the difficult questions, why don't you?
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. No, you don't. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Off the top of my head.
We don't have to include, we can strike that. We can edit this in post.
I do think you can X this out later if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure that they did get some investment backing.
Well, September 14th, 2022, Podimo secures 58.6 million to accelerate market expansion after seeing 5x year-on-year growth. Now, I don't know what the symbol stands for because it's the euro. Okay. 58.6 million euros they've raised. So they got some money.
What is their differentiation? Against like a luminary, like what are they seeing that others?
I think they're not luminary, which everybody loves to pile on top of.
Yes.
Well, is luminary available outside of the US, or is it just a US?
It is now, because Luminary have jumped on the back of Apple Podcasts, of course, and so now they used to be available in five countries, and now they're available in 192. So there you go.
That's better.
That's probably a benefit. Podimo's last financial report was released in July of 2023, and they did make, nice revenue, 33.7 million US dollars, but they also made $49 million worth of loss. So they are most certainly not a profitable organization quite yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting to go back to the core point you were making, James. What it seems like is one of the big outcomes this year is that publishers who are starting to say, we're going to gate your content and we're not going to distribute it everywhere if they have an exclusive deal, like Spotify being the lead example. We're seeing that start to go away. I think we can safely deduce that their reach expands, which means the ad impressions opportunity expands. And if they're doing rev share deals versus the minimum guarantee deals, and you want to court, Trevor Noah or whoever, rather than going, oh, well, you have to do it only on our platform, they don't have to pony up tens of millions of dollars to get that deal. They can go, hey, we're going to do a rev share, but we're going to put it out everywhere and we're going to lead it. So I think that may be a way of getting big talent and defraying costs. But it sounds like we're jumping into a large issue as well, which is, how is everybody doing that's just trying to do a specific subscription for their individual show? And one thing I think I've been able to learn about how those models work, the biggest problem is you need to siphon your audience from somewhere on an ongoing basis, or you run out of audience, or you never hit critical mass. And so, what I think a lot of people do or will do is land on a hybrid approach where they say, okay, Monday through Friday, like I think you probably see this out of Daily Wire and some other folks where it's like, all right, we're going to give you your shows every day, but if you want the extra special show, you have to pay the subscription and get that behind the paywall. We'll see how widely that's adopted, but I'd be really surprised if it made a big impact on the ad-supported market for most mainstream programs. And kind of tying to some of the other, what was a perceived thing that happened this year and what was a real thing. Skye, I want to come back to you because there was a lot of, pearl clutching. I was clutching my pearls coming into this year because we all heard about the great economic headwinds, this foreboding recession that we were all preparing for. Did it happen or not? Like, did it happen to our industry, but not to the broader marketplace? Like, how do you break this down? What happened?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, just the term economic headwinds became like almost a trope within podcasting this past year. I felt like we heard it over and over again from executives in charge of announcing bad news. And, the Great Recession has not happened. And I would say two things about that. One is, even if there are fears of a recession, of course, that it's a psychological thing, right? And advertisers and others are going to pull back. But, they're going to pull back. But I also think that, there were executives out there who also used that to cover maybe just a few of those bad decisions that were made. It was sort of an easy way to say, well, we're going to do layoffs because, yes, I made these bad decisions, but also we've got a fear of recession and, these economic headwinds, and we're going to have to make change. But my advice to the advertisers, to people who are sort of looking at this market right now, is that this is probably a great time to get involved with buying podcast advertising or investing in shows and investing in the people that make them, because the market's down. And, I've heard it many, many times, you buy low and sell high. So why not, if you are in a position, if this podcast is being directed towards people who are in charge of audio and advertising, what I would say to them is this is probably a great time because stuff is less expensive and still really impactful. There's lots of research that shows that advertising on podcasts is incredibly impactful, more than any other medium. And this is a great time to get your money's worth. I mean, I'm hearing way too many podcasts right now that don't have any ads at all. And it's crushing. It's devastating for someone like that, for someone like me, to listen to an incredible show and say, we'll be right back. And here we are again. I mean, it's just terrible. It's crushing. We got to change that.
Yeah, well, and I want to hear Ariel's point on this, but I also want to just underscore what you're saying, Skye. As a broker, I think that the Warren Buffett comment applies when people are being greedy, be fearful, and when they're being fearful, be greedy, right? And all year it has become much more of a buyer's market. I think as a buyer looking at it on behalf of brands, we were struggling because first we had to explain to people what a podcast was and start monetizing it. And then when the thing got so hyped up in the last few years and we got into COVID, it was like pricing started to get irrational and outside of what we should see even in a mature marketplace. And there was a lot of pride. There was a lot of hubris with publishers, and they just kept raising the bar because they could get away with it. Well, now we're seeing the backlash of that, which is bad for the publishers, but their loss is your gain if you're an advertiser. And so we've definitely seen that take effect. And so it's a very positive thing for a lot of people. A lot of this bad news has actually been good news for some, and it hasn't stopped the marketplace from growing. Ariel, what were you thinking on this one?
Yeah, I think Skye is completely right in that a lot of podcasting companies have fallen back on. I'm very sorry about the ambient baby noise in the background. Anyway, but they've turned to an uncertain economy as a fallback for why these cuts are being made. Obviously, that's not the only reason why, but I do want to make sure that we're still couching the podcasting industry within the larger news media industry, and that a lot of the cuts you're seeing are particularly from outlets that are either news focused or have some sort of news component, or are podcasting departments within publications. So right, because you are seeing this all over the place, and it's not just podcasting. Digital media overall is taking a really, really big hit. And you're right, there is no recession. It is a little hard to explain why it's been so difficult. But it's for better or worse, podcasting's fate right now, or at least this part of podcasting is tied to the rest of the news industry. And until they also figure their stuff out, it's going to be a hard thing to overcome. So because, and again, you look at Vox Media, we had plenty of layoffs. BuzzFeed, Jezebel was shut down for a little bit until they were mercifully bought by someone else. So it's for me too. I have to remind myself when I'm writing the newsletter, just take a little bit more of a bird's eye view and see where it lives within the larger ecosystem.
Ariel, that's a great point. And I think we do need to remember that even though we work in an industry that's been affected, it's not the only industry that's been affected. And I think we have to kind of grade things on a curve as we're judging ourselves and our peers in our industry. I want to put you back in the hot seat, Ariel, on what you see happening from a programming standpoint as a byproduct of some of these changes. I know that there's been what some might call a retrenchment to safer bets. What does that look like if I'm a publisher, or what am I thinking about putting more of and less of out next year? And if I'm a buyer, how should I, what should I be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think the thing that I've been hearing, and the thing that's maybe the most depressing, has been the people talking about what kind of, when I got back from maternity leave, I was catching up with people to see what kind of stuff they were working on, what they were interested in investing in, and it's more celebrity podcasts, maybe not with as big upfront minimum guarantees. I think a lot of those deals are going to change, but they're still kind of going towards bringing a beloved old TV star back to talk about whatever, or kind of short little news podcasts, kind of like in the up first model. And it's kind of boring. Like, it's really just it's safe, it's a sure thing. And for me, I was really surprised when I saw that Apple podcast of the year was the Julia Louis-Dreyfus show, which is fine for a celebrity podcast, but like I think it's really hard to argue that that's the best show of the year. And you know, I think that I think it's a reflection of the trends that we're seeing. That being said, I do think having all of these people laid off means that they're going to be working on some interesting stuff. So we might see, I'm hoping, right, to see some innovation and to see some really cool content come out of this bust. Is it going to be widespread? Is it going to be monetizable really so far this year? I don't know. So I am hoping that maybe towards the end of the year, we start to see, you know, something spicy. But you know, it may take a little bit.
Well, I want to recruit the three of you because you all have a platform to help make this industry better. You're highlighting something that I think has been a fear of ours for years, because I'm a former radio guy, and James has shares the same background. Is, you know, we could call it the radioification of podcast is a real threat to the quality of the industry. When we start seeing, I mean, we're already starting to see the spot breaks go, you know, hang on till after these messages. Okay, well, all of a sudden you just took out, you know, the industry and said, we're not that different anymore. Now, if we just start going to chatty, you know, blowhard topics, people just, you know, ranting on soapboxes or doing really light interviews. And, you know, when you start seeing the morning zoo crew show up in a podcast feed, that's where, you know, we've jumped the shark. Like when it gets wacky and the production quality is crap, but it's disposable content. It's cheap to manufacture. That's when I think we're moving in the wrong direction. And I hope we continue to call that out as an industry when we see the degradation in the kind of median quality of what's being produced.
I also want to make sure to give Papa Nick, some credit here in that.
Papa Nick.
I mean, last year he wrote that big piece for.
How long has he been Papa Nick?
He's my Papa Nick.
Can we all?
I think we're the same age. So, you know, but last year he wrote that piece for New York Mag about, you know, how podcasting hasn't had a big hit in the vein of Serial. And I think that people really reacted to it. And I think they reacted to his assertion of that there hasn't been this level of hit and you really need this level of hit. And I think maybe they missed the bigger picture, which is exactly what we're talking about right now, is that without the sustained success of narrative shows, you're going to have podcasting that looks a lot like commercial radio. And that is not what we want. So
that is not what we want.
So I want to give him a little credit where credit is due. Okay.
So very fair and very helpful. And yeah, Nick Qua has made a great contribution as a voice in this industry. So glad to hear you shout him out. So tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. You know, I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, you know, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com. James, can we talk about YouTube a little bit? I mean, I know we could do an episode with us talking about YouTube easily, but I do want to get to predictions, and I fear we're going to run out of time. But how do you summarize YouTube's impact on the audio industry, namely podcasts, in 2023?
I think it's a fascinating time. YouTube seemingly hasn't done an awful lot of editorial work around podcasting, but even so, we're seeing a ton of research coming out saying that YouTube is variously the number one app for discovery of new podcasts, or indeed the number one app for consumption of podcasts. Sounds Profitable released some data relatively recently saying that Joe Rogan is watched by 72%, I think, of all of his viewers are on YouTube, not on Spotify, which should probably give Spotify a little bit of cause for concern. But of course, YouTube has managed all of this without actually launching yet properly their podcast platform. And I think it's going to be fascinating looking at what happens in 2024. I mean, they launched Google Listen, then they launched Google Play Music, only in the States and Canada. Then they launched Google Podcasts. So maybe fourth time is the charm with YouTube Music. But they do have someone who has a steeped background in this area, Steve McClendon, who used to work for the 60dB, which was a personalized audio stories app. He completely understands audio, and I think you can see that in the YouTube Music app, because it is a very good, compelling podcast consumption app. So fascinating to see what happens there for next year. But of course, what that means for the audio officer, for the chief audio officer, is that the rules around advertising in YouTube are different. Host reads aren't blocked, but 30-second spots are. And obviously, programmatic ads aren't going to work at all. And I wonder whether or not YouTube having podcasts is going to confuse both consumers about what a podcast is and the ad market about what a podcast is as well. And I'm kind of looking at that and going, will this destabilize the industry during 2024, when all of a sudden YouTube Music, which is a pre-installed app on Android, which is the biggest mobile platform in the world, will that destabilize things, and what effect will that have on our industry?
Yeah,
well,
James,
and
oh, sorry. You go ahead.
No, I was going to set it up. I mean, James, and maybe Skye can chime in on this, because I know she has some thoughts. But when a podcast shows up on YouTube and there's a video component, is it even still a podcast?
This drives me nuts. Okay, I know, James, you're supposed to speak first, but yeah, let me hear your words, James, first.
Now, I was just going to say that my definition of a podcast is whatever the audience calls it. And that's, I've always been driven by whatever the audience wants.
But even you were just saying that it muddies the waters a little bit. Would you not agree with that? It muddies the waters, and I think it's already so hard for podcasts to have become a thing that the mainstream acknowledges as a thing, to then refer to videos of podcasts as podcasts. Like, every time that happens, a little piece of me dies when I hear that come out of. It's always, like a millennials. I mean, no offense, Ariel. It's always someone who's a lot hipper than me who says it. And
millennials are not hip anymore. I would really just want to correct the record there.
Okay. Maybe it's Gen Z. It's probably my kids in the other room. But, to me, I feel like the fact that podcasts are primarily made for the ear, or were at least in the beginning, that is our core differentiation. And I have no problem with podcasters leveraging YouTube for discovery and, to grow their audience. All of that is goodness. I mean, do that. But the wording of it, like language matters. And to me, it just makes my blood boil in a weird way that I don't usually get angry when people.
Well, Skye, let me see if I can make you. So let me, but let's bat this around for a minute. So we're recording the Media Roundtable podcast right now. Mm-hmm. We've got some major players in the industry on this one. Okay, so this thing is going to be the shot around the world. All right. Now, when we post clips of it or the whole thing in its entirety on YouTube, are you saying this conversation is no longer a podcast because we have video on?
I'm saying that it's a video of our podcast recording, which is what it is.
Go ahead, James.
I'm less concerned with what the consumer calls it, and more concerned in this conversation with what the chief audio officer is going to think. And how the chief audio officer is going to get their brands into these things, because it's a very, very different world in terms of YouTube. And, I've stood on stages before now and said that if YouTube becomes the number one place where we all consume our podcasts, then the entire industry is dead. Because we won't need people to sell 30-second spots, because there won't be any. We won't need hosting companies. We won't need so many different bits of this industry if YouTube ends up being number one. Now, we can just look back at the illustrious list of Google podcast apps to realize that that's possibly not going to happen. But nevertheless, it's a real concern if YouTube ends up being a large player. So I'm hoping that Google ends up being maybe a 20% player in this market, but no more. But even then, it's going to be really confusing for someone who wants to get their brand out there. How do I advertise on a YouTube podcast, video podcast? You know what I mean? I mean, I don't know, Ariel, whether you share any of that or.
Well, I'm curious, Dan. I'd like to learn from you too, right? What's the trade-off in terms of what you can make on YouTube versus traditional podcasting? Because on one hand, YouTube, the reach is so large, but the CPMs are peanuts. I mean, they're practically nothing. So how does that? I remember when I was researching the economics of podcasts, when I was doing the list for Forbes on how people made money on podcasts, which was quite an adventure. But at the time it was like, they would kind of like lump in their YouTube views into their overall downloads number and then still trying to charge it at the main CPM. But like, that's not how YouTube works. And if YouTube does get even to that 20% threshold that James is talking about, that's got to distort those CPMs, right?
Yeah, here's how I would look at it on behalf of the buying community, is that complexity is not our friend. If you think about, I think that that large agencies and large brands have to create a bunch of rules. And right now they draw their lines all different places. So some people put podcasts in their radio line item. Some people put it under digital because they're streaming heavy. Some people have a digital audio line item. But how that is coded for a brand when they set their budgets is really, really significant. And so I remember in the early days, I mean, we're really talking 5 to 10 years ago, there were a lot of networks working very hard to go to Madison Avenue, meet with the big holding companies and fight for them to add podcasting as a line item on their budgets. And I think that is happening increasingly. I think that the momentum is there and it's going to be the rule. So the challenge is if you force a new definition to something that is a podcast that goes on video, if it's a native audio conversation that you're now distributing with a video on a video platform, probably YouTube, possibly elsewhere, somebody's going to have to go fight that battle all over again, or the video impressions will get neglected. And so we kind of have some infrastructure around people doing influencer marketing with YouTube influencers. And then you have podcast and audio influencers. But when they cross over between the two, it can really get lost in the shuffle. And if you want creators to maximize the revenue they could be getting to support their shows, the best way to do that is to give them simple definitions for the brand community to buy through. So you might be right. Technically, we might be able to be more precise if we add more words to the lexicon, but we're already so chaotic. We're already so disorganized without common definitions of things in this industry. I'd hate to increase that any further than we already have.
So you're saying it's interesting because what you're saying is that it actually, what I'm seeing as complicating what a podcast is, you're saying actually keeping the term podcast, even if it's on YouTube, keeps it simpler for the advertising buyer. And that makes complete sense to me. So
yeah, because otherwise they've got to go across the hall and go to the influencer team and go, hey, can I get some of your revenue to put against the video component of this podcast? You don't want them having to do that. The more steps they got to take, the less likely they are to do it. So
100%.
Yeah. So I think it's actually better for their business if we can forego that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get that. I still am going to have trouble with just the language of it, but somehow I'll get through it. But I get the reason for it. I get the reason for it from a business perspective. Yeah. I just, I don't like the idea that we are sort of giving away what I feel is so much of our value, which is that we are ultimately designing for someone's ear, and that is what sets us apart from books, television, like everything else. That is, we've cornered the market on the ear. I mean, aside from music, of course. And I think that there is a different experience when you actually listen to something in your ears and you don't look at a video. I fell in love with podcasting, and I know this is a detour and I'll get back on track in a second, but I fell in love with podcasting because of what it did to my experience when I was interacting with the medium just in my ears. So I think it's that part of it that that I mourn when people refer to it in a way that makes me, sad.
Yeah. Well,
it is sad, but oops, sorry.
No, please. I want to hear. Let's lament.
I was going to say it is sad, and let me be clear, it is sad. But the unfortunate reality is, TikTok is still the #1 discovery platform in the world, and you can't go viral on TikTok without a video. Like it's just this inescapable thing, and it's the same with music too. Like, it's not just is the music good; it's does a song apply to some like stupid TikTok dance trend get plugged into all these different videos. And that's something that
we might have to make peace with in the short term.
Yeah,
we might. Exactly. But let me make one more point, which is that earlier we were all sort of lamenting the idea that we're, at least in the short term, in order to figure out what the winning business model is, a lot of these companies will have to spend more money on more inexpensive shows, chat shows, things where a piece of it can go viral more easily, or, something that is inexpensive to make, that isn't a narrative, serialized, et cetera, et cetera. And the growth within YouTube of that, and the growth of, podcasters trying to figure out how to take advantage of all these different platforms, the TikToks and this and that, are just going to push podcasting in that direction. When podcasting, what I love about it is that it's like this slow medium. It's not something that can be like, you don't get the same experience by watching a clip of a podcast on TikTok. You're not getting the deep, forgive me for saying it, here's another trope, the intimate relationship that you have with the people who are making that podcast when they're in your ears is just not going to happen when you're seeing it on TikTok. Again, I get what you're saying, Dan, about the business element of it, but I just feel like it does take us away. All of the things that we're talking about take podcasts, splice and break podcasts up into something completely different, that to me, they don't do the same thing. They don't have the same impact on the listener in the end.
Well, I'm going to just wrap this up and move us to our final section by agreeing with you and sharing some of your grief, because I do believe that audio has a special relationship with the audience. I believe that there's no more intimate way to connect with somebody. But, I think I'm just at peace with the idea that we need to be a little flexible here, because right now discovery is a problem. Audio discovery is a disaster compared to video channels. And while we're still growing and kind of getting our footing, we may need to just go where audiences are with the same core content. And yeah, you've got some, like satellite radio carries CNN and the cable networks. It's not the same as what it was designed for, to be seen. On the other hand, if they can expand their footprint, advertisers can benefit from it. It's more revenue opportunities to support the content. Maybe we look the other way on that for the time being. But I hear your grievance. Your grievance is registered. And thank you for sharing it here on the Media Roundtable. Can we talk about 2024 really quick? Because I know you guys are going to have to go, and our listeners are going to have to go. They only set aside like an hour for this. Hopefully they know to listen at like 1.5 speed to save time. I want to get you guys. That's right. So like Papa Nick. So check it out. So we have a big year coming up. They tell me there's an election in the United States that may have some impact. And there's a lot of volatility right now. We're like in the middle of this tech lash and COVID lash and all these different things changing. So I'm going to ask you guys to make some real hard predictions. And I've reworded them, as I warned you, to make it really binary, so you can't give me a it depends. So I'm going to tell you what the question is, and I'm going to ask each of you to just say like up, down, yes, no, and then you can share any other context you want around your answer. So here's the first one. In 2024, will all of audio, streaming, radio, smart speakers, podcasts, will audio consumption, will listenership be up or down over 2023? James, you want to go first?
I'm going to go for the third option, static.
Flat. All right. Okay. James says flat. Okay. Skye.
So I'm saying up, with the caveat, James, that earlier you said that downloads were down. Which seems to be in conflict with, what I'm hearing about listenership. So I am not a research analyst. I don't work at any of the firms. I have no inside knowledge, but I feel like it's going to continue to go up. I can't see it being static. I feel like this is a growth market.
All right, Ariel.
Up. At least for the US. It's an election year. People are going to be listening to podcasts like crazy during what I'm sure will be an extremely normal time.
A very normal time. No, and I agree with Ariel's prediction. I'm bullish. I think it's going to go up in aggregate. That doesn't mean there won't be some pain to spread around for some players that are dealing with legacy problems, but I think the consumer is going to continue to gravitate toward the spoken word. I think an election year is a great time for that. So totally agree with you guys. All right, next prediction. 2024, will revenue and I'll just call it the ad-supported side of audio, will that be up or down in 2024? Who wants to go first
again?
If you want to, but if you want to shirk it,
no, I will say revenue will be up, both ad revenue and also non-traditional advertising revenue as well. I think it's going to be up too.
Okay, and I'll jump in and say I agree with that prediction. Ariel, let's go to you.
Definitely up on the ad side. Again, political ad spending is going to be massive. Also in radio, and I do think there will be some bleed over into podcasting as well. And I hope James is right about that non-traditional revenue. Definitely hope to see subscription revenue increase as well. Maybe people have slightly less subscription fatigue than they did in the past.
Skye, how about you?
I mean, I have to say up. I mean, I feel like I got a cheat sheet for this one. Everyone went before me, but I do actually think it will be up. It should be up. If there are strategic buyers out there, it should be up.
Okay, and I want to also just underscore James's point about NTR as well. I think that, what we're contending with on the agency side of the business is we're looking at this really cool ecosystem that is podcasts. It's beautiful and a renaissance in programming and all this great stuff that was solving for all the gaps we had in radio for 100 years. Okay. Or at least recently. And then if you reduce it all to programmatic dynamically inserted ads and piles of breaks where you're just running one pre-produced commercial after another, you're missing something. The power of audio is in its authenticity. The power of audio is in leveraging that human-to-human connection and trust that a host shares with their audience. And NTR is something most people that work in the industry, I don't think, really even comprehend yet. We knew it from other media types, but the ability to take a relationship between brand and creator and create something that is new, that is not bound by clocks, to have ancillary integrations, live demonstrations, secondary interviews. Like, there are so many things that are low-hanging fruit for brands to be able to do to engage with an audience that are more than just trafficking through an exchange. I think that is a massive untapped opportunity. Even the merch business on top of subscriptions. Look at the way music's going. I think that we have a lot of blue ocean to take advantage of. So definitely agree on that. All right. CPMs. So let's think about this in terms of the value of an impression. Do we think that the impressions in audio, that includes podcast, radio, and streaming, are going to be higher or lower in 2024? And just for context, I think the general consensus is that the CPMs came down in 2023 over 22, right? So what do you think they're going to do in 24? Let's start with you, Ariel.
I think they're going down. Which I think is also connected to that political ad spend, because those don't tend to go for top rates anyway.
Yeah.
So if you take it in overall, does that mean like kind of will a normal brand's CPM necessarily be lower? Not necessarily, maybe it would be level. But I have a hard time seeing it going up, at least in the short term.
How about you, Skye?
I agree. I think there's going to be too much of a hangover from this year, and it will be down.
James?
Yeah, and I think, from my radio background, I wish that it will continue to go up, because it is essentially the value in this particular business. I'm pretty convinced that there will be parts of the industry that won't be fighting for that value, and unfortunately, I think that yield will go down. Which I think is a mistake, because we should be fighting on keeping cost per thousands up as far as possible.
So I'll say down in aggregate, but to be really specific, I think podcast is going to go up a little bit, because I think we went too far one way, then of course we over course correct and go another way, and now I think we went down, and now I think we're going to inch up incrementally. Radio, I think, has to continue to decline. I think that's what, I think as long as there's radio, it's probably going to be in decline on the value of an impression. And I think the same thing is true in streaming. We've got Pixelgeddon coming, and a lot of the streaming audio success has been predicated on the measurability for brands to be able to use pixels. And as that gets harder in a new environment, what they're projecting is going to be a post-pixel world, I think that's going to be harder to do. So I'm going to say in aggregate will go down, but I think podcasts will see some bright spots. Okay. Content investment. You guys already kind of did answer this earlier, but let's just clarify it for the record. Because look, at the end of the year, we're going to look back at this stuff and we're going to go, were we right or were we wrong? So let's start with you, Skye. Are people going to spend more or less on content in 24 than they did in 23?
I feel like this is an easy one, but maybe I'll be wrong. I think no, they will spend less.
They will spend less. James?
They will spend less.
Yes, I think definitely spend less on content. Yeah, absolutely.
Ariel?
Yeah, I'm not special. It's going to be less.
Yeah, it's going to be less. That's 4 for 4. I mean, this was kind of an easy one based on all the conversation we've had, but yeah, I imagine that they're going to keep kind of figuring out how little can we spend to hold audience and to hold revenue, and they're going to have to figure that out by finding the bottom of it, unfortunately. So, back to the zoo crew. All right.
Tragic.
Temporarily tragic. We'll see. We can still be bullish on the future.
Yes, for sure.
So another one I added was about standard definitions, because in my view, and I'm making an assumption, so you can even disagree with the question if you like, but I feel like we are wanting for standards and practices in this industry. The fact that we don't all have the same definition on what a podcast is, what a download is. You know, if you've ever tried to deal with brand safety and suitability, the standards that are used are all over the place. Do you think that in 2024, the industry will become more standardized in the way business gets done, or more chaotic than it was in 2023? And let's start with you, James.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy for us to say, oh, it's very complicated. Nobody really understands what a download is. I mean, at the end of the day, everybody does understand what a download is, and the IAB has done a really good job of making sure that people have an understanding of what that is. Having said that, of course, Apple has their own definition, which doesn't align fully with the IAB. Spotify for podcasters itself has its own definition, and who knows what YouTube is going to do, because that, again, is a whole new world in there as well. It would be really helpful, I think, if those big companies were to align with the IAB's definitions and to align with their plan going forward. I think that would be super helpful. As for the IAB's place in 2024, I'm fascinated to watch what's happening with the recertification that the large companies have. As far as I can see, there are some very large companies that have not recertified and will not be IAB compliant by the end of the year. So I'm fascinated to see whether the IAB will be the arbiter of all of this in 2024, or whether actually we might end up with the Podcast Advertising Bureau, an organization that cares about podcasting rather than everything else that happens to be online. And that would be my wish, I think, for next year.
All right. Ariel, are we going to get more standardized or more chaotic? And you can also argue with the question.
I think I went in thinking it would be more standardized, and James brought up many different factors that could mess that up. But I do think I don't have a certain answer on that, but I do think that the issue with the Apple Podcast downloads, and that the fact that like one little bug like that could have such an effect on numbers. Right. I do think it's going to force some kind of action. I don't know what that is. I don't know if that is something that's resolvable within a year. But I do think there will be an effect from that. So
more chaotic.
Yeah.
More chaotic, but I think on the long arc towards standardization,
becoming standardized. Yeah, I did want to say in regards to that Apple thing, that I was listening to a podcast this morning. I mean, a successful podcast, it's a business, they're successful, but they were saying, if you love this podcast, please click automatic download. I mean, it was just interesting. It's sort of the first, I think we're going to start hearing that from people just because of the download issues that happened with iOS. And that's kind of fascinating to watch. And I got to be honest, don't really have a strong opinion on this one. Not my area of expertise. But I think somewhere in the middle.
I think I'm probably, and it may not be the fairest question for me to ask you guys. I'll just share the kind of the genesis of it, because I think it's important for the industry, which is when people are buying it, when people are supporting it financially, the rules that we have to deal with, or lack thereof, from network to network is crazy. Like, You do a deal with a host and you assume that they're going to be an exclusive endorser of a product. Well, some networks are now deciding, well, they can endorse two competitors. That's fine. That's our rule, right? Now in radio, that almost never happened, except for Howard Stern, who would do that from time to time. Pretty much everybody else, they would have one brand per category. The breaks would be the breaks. If they were going to change a variable in how they're doing business with you, they'd notify you beforehand. We're seeing everybody going their own way and making up standards and practices, whether or not definitions is the right way to put it. There is a lack of standardization in the way business is done in this industry that is super problematic. And I see it getting worse before it gets better, because when we don't have a common language, you get chaos, and we feel the impact of that frequently as rules change without warning and are different from one publisher to another. So my prediction is that it's going to get worse before it gets better, and that the pain that that's going to cause is going to be productive long term, because it will force us to, if we're going to have a podcast advertising bureau, it will force us to figure it out when we kind of get sick and tired of being sick and tired. That's when change occurs. That's what I think needs to happen. So when you guys are reporting in 2024 about how consumer confidence is being lost because of this thing that wasn't clear, or that, like, simple example, using AI to have a host voice an ad. Okay, there's no rules about that people have standardized. But when it starts happening, we're going to start seeing rules pop up. And I think, unfortunately, we have to stub our toe a lot to get there. So that's why that's an important one for the business of podcasts to me. We're about to wrap, and this has been magnificent. I think we could all go even longer on these topics for sure. Did we miss anything? Are there any predictions or final comments anybody wants to throw out there?
We're going to get way, way too many political podcasts during an election year that are going to sound exactly the same.
Yes.
And they're not all going to be successful.
Correct.
And that will be a good learning experience for lots of companies. I will still die a tiny death when people say podcast about their video.
But it's a fractional
But I will
death.
remember,
But I will
remember
life,
what
right?
Dan told me, and then I will not feel as bad. I will remember
you.
what I learned on the podcast.
Thank you.
And I think from my point of view, AI is going to be fascinating to watch. I will never get more bored than receiving yet another press release about yet another podcast which has been made wholly with AI. And isn't this exciting? But nevertheless, I'm sure that AI will be a useful tool for the generation of shows. Possibly not the audio that you hear, but an awful lot of the other stuff that goes on with a show as well, and I think that will certainly be something to watch.
And Ariel, do you want to bring us home?
Yeah, one thing I definitely have my eye on are these talent deals that are coming up for renewal. So that's Joe Rogan's the big one, but Call Her Daddy as well. There all these deals that happened 3 or 4 years ago are finally, they're up again, and it's a very different economy. So I think what we're going to see is, this kind of goes back to the question of, are we going to see more investment in content and talent or less? I think that I don't think these deals aren't going to happen. I think they're going to happen in some form, but I do think that they're going to look pretty different. Definitely less on the minimum guarantee front. They'll probably look more like the Trevor Noah deal, where he got, I think it was like $4 million up front and then a cut of the advertising thereafter. If Trevor Noah had done his deal a couple of years ago, he probably would have gotten more like 80 million, but that's fine. And basically some different structured, less exclusive deals that still keep these people attached to one studio or another, but maybe not $200 million for Joe Rogan this time, but we'll see.
Okay, so is anybody ready to bet if Rogan stays on Spotify or not? I'll vote. I'm going to, and I have no inside information. I'm going to vote that he does.
That he stays?
That he stays. I'm voting stay.
Okay,
Anybody
just to be fun, I'm going to vote that he leaves.
Ah.
Yeah, I'm going to vote that he leaves as well, and he gets snapped up by YouTube. I'm sure he won't.
Not X.
Ariel, what do you know? What do you know?
I don't. Let me be clear. I don't think anyone knows aside from Joe Rogan, and you know what? He doesn't know because he changes his opinion very quickly about a variety of things. But if I had to guess, I think short of YouTube coming in with like $500 million and a pony, I really don't think. I think he's going to stay in some capacity. But his deal, I would expect would look quite different.
All right, and now we know what part of the show we're going to highlight first when we market it. And breaking here, top journalists.
Top journalists knows exactly what Joe Rogan is thinking.
Ashley Carmen's going to write this one up.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. What do we
All right.
win? I mean, there needs to be a prize.
Oh, well, you've helped the industry tremendously, and we're going to get
That's all the reward we need, Dan.
completely. Listen, you guys, this was a lot of fun, and I hope you guys had a good time, so you'll come back and do it again. It's super valuable stuff. Ariel, James, Skye, thank you for being a part of this panel. If you're a chief audio officer, buckle up, keep listening. We're going to keep doing this every week in some form or fashion, and you will hear James Cridland again. And if we're lucky, we'll get Skye and Ariel to come back as well. Thank you for the predictions. In January, we're going to look back at the predictions we made at Oxford Road in January to see how accurate we were. We're going to let you decide and get our report card on that, and we'll be reporting that to you here. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and to use your influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, and to rise above our differences and show that collaboration is possible when we treat each other with respect. We'd love to hear from you. Any feedback, suggestions, email us, info@mediaroundtable.com. And if you're a marketer looking to align with our vision, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com, subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Special thanks to Bianca, Haley, Scott, Mary Jane, Everett, all the people I'm forgetting in podcast one. And before I say the final tagline, where can people find you great individuals? Ariel, what's your plug?
Wait,
You got
like
to tell them how to subscribe.
than...
Yeah, how do you want people to contact you?
Oh,
sorry, I should have set you up for this.
I really don't use social media, so just email me. I'm at ariel.shapiro@theverge.com.
What, do you have a newsletter you'd like them to subscribe
And I have a
to?
newsletter. It's called Hot Pod, and
I've heard of this.
we
Hot Pod.
and we write about the audio industry, podcasting in particular.
Isn't that Nick Quah's newsletter?
I hear that's what
I'm
I
just
hear.
kidding. Perfect. All right, Hot Pod for Ariel. Okay, Skye, how about you? You got a plug?
Sure. You can find me at thisisthesqueeze.substack.com, and you can email me at skypillsatwork@gmail.com.
James, bring us home.
And yes, I run two newsletters, a daily one called podnews.net. It's very good, highly recommended, free, and a weekly one, podnews. No, it's not. And a weekly one, podcastbusinessjournal.com, which contains a long-form interview in there every week and lots of exciting stock graphs.
This is a solid sales pitch. All right, everybody, influence responsibly. Have a good end of the year.